Trade war and diplomacy, two faces of the same thing, conflict. We applaud free trade and impose tariffs. Have we exaggerated the benefits of free trade, which are good in theory and fact, but up to a certain point? Think America and China. And what exactly is that point where economic theory becomes brutal fact? Join me and Darash for How We Got Here.
Trade wars are not a modern phenomenon. They have roots deep in economic history, from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of the 1930s, which exacerbated the Great Depression, to recent tensions between global powers. The implications of imposing tariffs and trade barriers have long been debated. Central to this discourse is the question, does everyone really benefit from free trade? In today's landscape, the intrications between three major players, China, the United States and the European Union, illustrate the complexities of trade relationships. The ongoing trade war between China and the West has intensified, driven by concerns over unfair practices and economic imbalances. China's trade dynamics, particularly in the electric vehicle sector and renewable energy products, have become focal points of contention. The EU's recent decision to impose punitive tariffs on Chinese EVs comes after China's own retaliatory tariffs on EU brandy imports. This growing imbalance, with Chinese exports to the EU soaring while imports from Europe have declined, reflects a troubling trend. The renewable energy sector further illustrates the friction between these economic giants. As nations race to gain lead in green technology, competition intensifies. China's dominance in manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines creates tension, as Europe and the US strive to protect their emerging industries. As the EU, US and China navigate these tumultuous waters, the question of whether everyone truly benefits from free trade remains critical. While free trade can foster innovation and lower prices, the uneven distribution of benefits often leads to domestic backlash and calls for protectionism.
Our guest today is Witold Orłowski, economist and professor at the Warsaw University of Technology. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
Trade wars, we're going to be talking about now. At least two on the horizon, if they're not occurring already. China and the EU, and China and the United States. What's your evaluation of the inevitability of these?
And by the way, hopefully not the United States versus the European Union.
Yes, that used to be a kind of a tension point, wasn't it, a couple of years ago?
Possible, imaginable.
Yes. Why do these trade wars happen? And is it right to call them a war?
Yes, it is. Basically, since at least 200 years, the economists are telling that the free trade is kind of, everybody's benefiting from the free trade. And somehow it is against the common sense, because the common sense is telling you, okay, if I impose tariffs on the production of my neighbor, then his products are more expensive, and people will opt for buying our domestic products and will be better off, right? There are two problems with that. The first one is that actually it's the consumer that's paying the price for this, because by the end of the day, he's paying a higher price on the market. But more interestingly, if I impose a tariff on the products of the neighbor, then the neighbor most likely will answer to it imposing tariffs on imports from my country. The result is that in both countries prices are up, consumers are consuming less, and actually everybody is worse off. And that's a trade war. The trade war is actually a situation when there is some escalation. I mean, I introduced the tariffs on something, in the retortion, my neighbor is introducing the tariffs on my products, and I accelerate, I speed up the race by tariff new products, and so on and so on. And actually, tariffs are basically a normal thing in the economy. I mean, we use it, obviously, after, let's say, 70 years of the liberalization of the trade that was made in the second half of the 20th century. with the General Agreement on Tariffs, Trade and Tariffs, GATT, now under the WTO, World Trade Organization. Well, basically, all the nations agreed to use relatively low level of tariffs as a result, and to solve the issues that sometimes may appear by negotiations rather than by punishing the others with higher tariffs.
Is this a point that powers have to reach before they start to arbitrate and negotiate?
Well, no. Normally, you you increase the tariffs, you give the explanation, and then the second side may sue you to the International Trade Organization, and the International Trade Organization is kind of a tribunal that may judge either are you right or wrong. Obviously, a powerful country can say by the end of the day,
yes.
So we leave. We leave the WTO. It is also imaginable with the biggest. But for the time being, let's say that the majority of developed nations, of trading nations, including China, obviously, including the United States, including the European Union, are participating in this system. Why do we call it a war? I mean, it's a war when you see that this is a tool to force your partner to change somehow his policy, to resign from some profits, to make the situation better for you. So if it is massive, if it is made under kind of the announcement that this is a hostile move, that this is not just a normal normally it's happening from time to time that the countries introduce the tariffs. But if it is made in this type of the hostile way, and if it really starts to be wider and wider, and there is this escalation on both sides, that's the moment we call it a trade war.
You mentioned this idea of free trade, globalization, a general overall improvement of the world's material condition. Is there a flaw in that theory, in that the world has to accept these basic rules and accept the arbitration?
Well, you know, the point is that basically we've got, from the last 70 years, we've got the proofs that it's really helping, and we've got the kind of the proof on something different, on the fact that the trade war is devastating. The famous, probably, trade war was the situation from less than a century ago, when a big crisis started in the United States, and then the reaction of the United States was, let's try to protect our economy by increasing tariffs of all the imports. Yes. The result was that obviously the other countries increased tariffs on the United States
that was the Great Depression,
and there was it was called the beggar your neighbor policy. The result was that the international trade was reduced by something like 70%, and the economic crisis, spread over the whole world, making the greatest depression in the history. So we've got that the trade war is actually not benefiting anybody, and we know that, on the contrary, from the experience of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, that actually the free trade is good for everybody. Obviously, all the nations want to get some kind of better for them conditions for this trade, and that's why all these agreements were on GATT and WTO were a kind of universal agreement. Everybody is reducing tariffs at the same time. So without the situation, somebody is doing it and the others are having benefits at the expense of this one country. But as you already noticed, there are, in last few years, there appeared new voices, especially Donald Trump in the United States he was threatening China, Europe, yes. Mexico, with trade wars. Definitely, there's no doubt a trade war, because all the political rhetorics behind that is not that this is just some fine-tuning of the trade. This is the general tariff of all the products. During the first term of Donald Trump as a president, we will see either there will be a second term, but we don't know. But during the term that passed 4 years ago, he actually started the wars. But then something happened that basically we hope very much that this is the result. Actually, the war was declared, but then it was actually kind of opening the invitation to negotiations.
There's a symbolic
yes.
element to it.
Mr. Trump seems to be kind of this tough businessman that loves to use this type of the role. I mean, I treat you as a war, as a developer, as a president of the United States, and then let's negotiate on some improvement of the condition of trade in my interest. But obviously we'll see what's happening. The same is now between China and the European Union. The whole discussion started from one product, from electric cars.
Yes.
But it may develop into the trade war, or hopefully it will be just the beginning of the negotiations with some compromise between two sides.
Well, on this point, though, China is not really into compromising, is it?
Well,
or is it?
If you play this game, you never start from telling that I'm ready for a compromise. I mean, you start from telling I will punish your products. Obviously, China is more, let's say, interested in exporting to Europe and to the United States than the vice versa. So, in a sense, it's more in the interest of China to avoid the war. Obviously, for the war, trade war with China would have paid, everybody would have paid for. But definitely for China is more interesting China is more interested in keeping the trade free.
I mean, there have been historical examples where trade wars have then mushroomed into real wars with guns and send the gunboats in to sort out the opium between Britain and China. Is that a danger in these things, that they get advanced to a certain point and then force takes over?
I'm afraid of the escalation of the trade wars. I'm not really afraid of the fact that the trade wars these days may change into some other form of the war. That was a 19th century type of situation with the opium wars and so on.
Diplomacy.
When the armed forces were seen as a tougher way of forcing the other countries to follow the will of the others. I'm very much afraid of a lot of things happening in the geopolitics these days. But actually, I do not think that the trade war is going to be the trade war may be developed if it really starts between the US and China, the US and the European Union, and the European Union and China. Those are three biggest actual players in the world. And if there's a trade war among them, it may have a devastating effect for the global economy. But I do not think that it would translate into anything else but just the economic phenomenon.
The relationship between China and the United States, for instance, is very much a debtor-creditor nation. It's a very intimate relationship, which neither of them want to jeopardize, ultimately.
Well, actually, the United States is taking, I mean, it's a nation, obviously, is making a lot of debt to China and buying on credit the Chinese goods. I mean, that has been the model of development for the last at least 40 years. Obviously, Mr. Trump at that moment is telling that this is not only about the trade and about the exports, about the credit. This is all about the intellectual property rights. The Americans are pretty much accusing China of not only exporting, but although, right or wrong, but stealing the technology, copying the technology, and so on and so on. And definitely it seems that the United States wants to get more of the benefits from the trade, not necessarily in the form of having more export to China, but for example, more royalties paid from the American technology. By the way, I use the name of Donald Trump, but actually President Biden, actually his closest economic advisor, also said something very similar to it. Maybe not as tough as Mr. Trump has been saying, but also said something about that America needs to have more benefits from the trade with China, and behind that there may be a threat of using the trade war as a way to force China to accept more the conditions of trade more beneficial for the United States.
A final question to you, Professor Orłowski. We have these international bodies, international organisations to adjudicate any trade disputes. Are they are they powerful enough to do that, to bring two people together, or is it like the UN, for example? Yeah. It's a kind of one big talking shop. Everybody tries to manipulate.
No, it's not a talking shop. It's not a talking shop, but it is based on the agreement, of all sides. I mean, if a country, if a power, a contract. We agree. We want a free trade, so we found out we created the mechanism, the vehicle for finding the compromise, helping to find the compromise. And actually, if a country like the United States decides that they don't want to follow the rules, they may at any moment leave the WTO, and the United States will survive with it. Smaller nations obviously not, but the US, yes. China hasn't been China joined the WTO, if I remember, some 20 years ago. Before China was not a member of it. You can also imagine China leaving. Well, the European Union is very much devoted to this multinational cooperation.
Yes, it seems to have that in its DNA.
And the form of solving the issues just by the discussions, by the negotiations. So the European Union is not likely to leave the WTO. But in the case of the United States, I mean, if at the moment of the escalation of the war, at some point the United States are being told, you must move back.
Yes.
And the United States doesn't want it. I mean, it's more plausible that they will leave the WTO rather than be forced by the WTO.
Like pushing an elephant that doesn't want to be pushed, I suppose.
Yeah. As far as we are talking about, small issues on several products, on the steel, the mechanism is working very well. But if we are talking about, I mean, hopefully not, but if there is an open trade war, for example, between China and the United States, I do not think that the WTO is capable of stopping it.
Is the body to do it. Professor Orłowski, thank you very much for coming on to the programme. Wonderful to have you. So that's it for today. Keep watching us and join us next time for How We Got Here.